grateful for this opportunity to share about my research and experience in co-creating rigorous and relevant knowledge under the sort of the larger category of research impact. Both these topics are really close to my heart as I've developed my academic identity, and I'm going to share a little bit about that. So I'm very, very grateful to Ibrat for creating this space and doing all the background work to get all of us together today. And just it's such a pleasure to see that there are people at various stages of their academic journey. And the story that I'm going to share with you today about my impact journey is really just one out of the many, many out there. So I'm very excited to also hear from you, hear your questions, hear about your efforts toward impact. So I'm hoping that we leave enough time at the end and in the chat function to really understand sort of where you're coming from and how we can support each other in, becoming an impact scholar. So I've been speaking at a lot of such similar spaces across different, forum. And so that has given me a chance to really think about, why I care about impact and what is my motivation. So if I have to, it sort of, for me, it goes back to growing up in India and spending a fair bit of my adult life there. And even though we were not poor, there was poverty all around us. So in those of you who may have lived in India or are joining from India can identify with this fact that a country and the context is fraught with social and environmental challenges. And I spent a fair bit of my life before I came to the US there. And so when I came to get my PhD, at a business school in the United States, I found it really hard to reconcile the two worlds. So here I was coming from this place fraught with so many challenges, and now in this fancy business school where my colleagues are thinking about how does the next Fortune 500 company make more money and improve their performance. And so there was sort of a lot of dilemma in my world in terms of, how do I reconcile the two? And over the course of, finding my voice, finding my questions, developing my identity as a scholar, I've realized many things that I'm going to share with you today. But what has really helped me is really sort of staying close to the context, close to sort of the people I'm studying, the context I'm studying, going back into the field, and really paying a lot of attention to the questions I'm asking, and not just thinking about impact as an afterthought at the end of my research process, but really thinking about research impact at the beginning, through the process, and much after, and making it a worldview that I adopt in asking and answering my research questions. So I want to also take a moment to share my journey so far, in the hopes that those of you who are already on this journey or are about to begin this journey can sort of draw some inspiration, because we always hear about so many challenges in academia for scholars who care about impact. And I'm not going to deny any of those challenges. They are very real, they are there for all of us. But I also want to take a moment to share this journey to hopefully inspire you a little bit in terms of how do you create your own space, your own niche as a scholar to be able to continue the work you're doing. So I think for me, the identity of an impact scholar really started coming together when I began my postdoctoral fellowship at Ivy Business School at the Network for Business Sustainability, that many of you may have heard about, or if not, I'm going to share in a little bit more about the Network for Business Sustainability. I worked with Tima Bansal, who I think is on the call today, and Tima really gave me sort of the inspiration, encouragement, and the voice to say that, yes, I care about impact and I want to be able to say that and work forward on that. So I was fortunate in that sense to not just have the context and the data to study impact and move toward impact, but also the support. Um, After my postdoctoral fellowship, I was an assistant professor at Anderson School of Management at University of New Mexico. And, I think your first academic job is just so important because you're learning the ropes and how do you do this stuff. And, depending on where you join, your future trajectory is likely to change. And what I found myself into a little bit by luck and a little bit by how I claimed that identity is an acceptance to care about impact and be able to include that in the work that I did. So a big portion of my research agenda is studying B Corps, and most of you might already know what B Corps are. If not, I'm happy to elaborate upon that when we have a dialogue at the end. But New Mexico, kind of like India, is fraught with many social and environmental challenges. And it's a growing B Corp ecosystem in New Mexico. So as an assistant professor there, I was able to contribute in the growth of that ecosystem and satisfy some of my desire to create impact. Right now, I'm an assistant professor at Andrew Young School of Policy Studies at Georgia State University. I'm also the director of the Social Entrepreneurship Program at the university. So what really helps me sort of take a step back and think about the opportunity in front of me is the fact that I'm not in a business school right now. And I can guarantee you, being on the both sides, being at a business school and now at a School of Policy Studies, that if this social entrepreneurship program was in a business school, it would look very different. So what I shared that to tell you that what I'm enjoying right now in terms of an opportunity is really not to start every conversation with how does this affect a business, but really take a zoom out and take a more systemic view of how do we really create change, and business being one way to do that. And again, I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A about my experience of being in a School of Policy Studies. So what I want to start with, and why all of us are here today, is really this phenomenon that commentators have talked about as research practice gap. So what a research practice gap really means is that research has largely failed to impact management practices because researchers and managers come from such different knowledge communities. And what does that really mean? Again, several of you, great scholars have already described these differences, including Tima and Jean Bartunek and Sarah Ryans and others. And there's really great work out there that I encourage you to read if you haven't. But if I were to summarize sort of what all of them have said, is that the way that researchers and managers define a problem, try to find a solution, and the kind of solution they come up with is very different between the two communities. So let's take a moment to think about what that difference looks like. So as researchers, the knowledge that we produce is quite descriptive, so we take our data, we analyze it, and our hopes is to explain a phenomena, why something may be happening, given that it's happening. While managers are really looking for prescription, they're looking for us or anybody to really tell them what to do in order to solve a problem. So again, very different approaches. Researchers also craft a problem and answer it very narrowly. Those of you who are defining your dissertation question may be experiencing this right now, that you're asked to really go deep and take a very small slice of the phenomena. While practitioners have many fires to address or put out every day, they're pulled in many directions. So they don't have that approach of going deep. In fact, they go pretty broad day to day in solving problems. We also produce very abstract knowledge. We are creating frameworks that are portable from one context to another, while managers are looking for very concrete knowledge for them to be able to solve the problem now, right now, in their daily work, in their industry, in their organization. I don't have to tell you how slow the research process is, understandably, because we are taking a very deep dive. Our publication takes years to come out, while managers do not have that luxury of time. They have to respond immediately to the problem facing them. So given these differences, it's not surprising that we as scholars struggle to impact practice. So what others have sort of talked about is that a couple of pathways to bridge that research practice gap. One is this idea that impact is a translation problem. So we don't have to change anything. We can continue on the path that we are on right now. And once we've produced the research insights, all we have to do is effectively translate them so that managers can use those insights. Some others say that impact is a problem of asking the right question. So they're saying that we're not asking relevant question. If we co-create, or not even co-create, if we understand what kind of questions will help managers, then we should be able to move forward toward impact. Both are very valid pathways to creating research impact. What I want to talk to you today in larger sort of context is this idea that bridging research practice gap is a knowledge production problem, that we can actually co-create knowledge together, which will be likely, is more likely to be used by managers. So others have defined co-creation as academic researchers and practitioners set out to research a problem where their interests intersect. So what is this largely broad definition of co-creation is done beautifully is really blossomed these many ways that people co-create knowledge. And I'm going to share a couple of them that I have sort of seen and participated in. But again, there are many, many out there in terms of models of co-creation. The larger idea being that if you involve managers in your research process, then your knowledge that you produce is both rigorous and relevant. Sort of the exciting slash unfortunate issue here is that it's not easy to co-create. It's not just a matter of bringing managers and research together for all the reasons that I listed in the prior slide. Such kind of collaboration is really fraught with conflict because of just the two paradigms are not incommensurable. They do not sort of speak to each other. So I say it is exciting because it gives us an opportunity as scholars, as researchers, to figure out, okay, if there is a conflict, if there is a tension, how can we make that generative? What would be required on our part to be able to engage with that tension and create something that is way more innovative and creative at the end of the process? So with this background, I think how I want to sort of spend our time together a little bit is dividing how I've approached impact into a couple of ways. I want to quickly share with you two research efforts or research projects that I have completed to give you a sense of how impact through research could look like. I want to share a little bit about the academic community building that I'm involved in to create a dialogue around and skill building around impact scholarship. I want to share a quick example that I'm currently involved in terms of collaboration with practice to show you a different model of how this collaboration would look like. And then I'm hoping that we spend a lot of time and dialogue together today to think about the opportunities and challenges that all of us are facing as early career impact scholars and how we can support each other. So in terms of my impact efforts through research, I'm going to share with you two papers that have recently come out studying impact and talking about impact in the context of knowledge co-creation. And I'm going to go into a little bit of detail for each of these papers, especially when I show you the data, and primarily because I want to give you a feel if you are yet to be involved in a co-creation project. I want to give you a feel of what these tensions that everyone talks about look like and what are the ways that people are grappling and finding ways to navigate those tensions. So we are going to zoom in, but we will zoom out and talk about what all of this means. So the first paper I want to share with you is sort of like is exactly the topic of our talk today about co-creating rigorous and relevant knowledge. And some of you may have already read the paper. I want to give you a little bit of sort of background on the paper and highlight some of the things that may be relevant for our discussion today. So the first thing I want to say is the motivation from this paper came from all the commentators and including managers and scholars saying that research is not only failing to impact practice, but also that management education is almost outdated. It's narrow, it's overly specialized. It's not really preparing our students to do what they want to do because our research does not have a real world relevance, because the people teaching or participating in management education do not have the insight and skills to be able to create future managers who can make a change in the world. So there's a wonderful paper by Bartonik and Rines in Journal of Management that came out in 2014, which you have, if you haven't read, I would highly recommend you to read it. What I found really striking was this graph in their paper, which really drove our project that I'm sharing with you today. The idea that not only is the conversation growing, that more and more scholars are talking about research impact, but look at the difference between empirical and non-empirical articles coming out in terms of talking about research impact. And what Bartonik and Rines are saying, and I fully want to agree and point, is that we are doing a lot of talking, but not really studying the phenomena and trying to using our skills as a researchers in trying to understand the phenomena of research impact, and then figuring out what all of us can do about it, and sort of getting off our soapboxes in a way and really putting on our hats as an analyst, analytical hat, and studying the phenomena. So that was really the driving force behind our paper, to really study what this phenomena looks like. So how we entered is that we looked at what is prior research said in terms of co-creation. And we soon discovered that what prior research has focused on are really these discrete episodes, events, or moments of co-creation. So they're looking at, okay, researchers and managers come together, what does their dialogue look like, et cetera, to honing in a point in time. What that does is that this event or this meeting carries all the weight of co-creation, which means that the differences become really stark. So the explanations that are out there really talk about these stark differences because they're focusing on this point in time. Those who focus on multiple points in time and not just one have largely taken a variance approach. What that means is that they're comparing. What they're really doing is sort of they're comparing successful points in time with unsuccessful points in time, to taking a variance approach. When Tima and I got into this project, based on our experience and based on our reading, we knew that research practice collaboration is often a long-term commitment. And so we deliberately took a process view, challenging some of these prior work, or filling or complementing even some of this prior work, which is either looked at a moment of time or taken a variance approach, and taking a deliberate process view to co-creation. And so the question that we asked was, how do researchers and managers imbricate rigorous and relevant knowledge given the challenges inherent in the process of co-creation? So I mentioned Network for Business Sustainability upfront. I want to take a moment to really describe their innovative model of providing or co-creating knowledge. And those of you who don't know Network for Business Sustainability, it's a Canadian nonprofit. Their mandate is to provide evidence-based insights to managers to be able to take actions around sustainability issues. And some of what I explained today has changed a little bit in terms of them not following this exact co-creation process. They've innovated and moved forward. And I'm going to, at the end of the talk, give you a sneak peek on what that innovation looks like. But when we were studying these different projects that NBS undertook, this is the process that they followed, or this is the stages that they followed. They had a group of about 10 to 15 managers who they call the Leadership Council. What this Leadership Council did is they met every year and they talked about what are our priorities as business leaders caring about sustainability, what issues do we want to address. So they would come up with a list of 10 to 11 issues like sustainability reporting, long-term thinking, embedding sustainability in culture, and so forth. NBS would then choose 2 issues and release a call for proposal, inviting researchers to respond and saying that we want to lead these 2 research projects, come respond, show your interest. They would choose the researchers who would be doing these 2 projects, and then they would go back to their Leadership Council and say, we have these 2 research teams, we want volunteers who would like to work with them. So 3 or 4 managers would join these research teams. These managers usually had functional experience, which meant if the team is studying responsible supply chains, these managers would have experience in responsible supply chain. NBS would then, at the end of these projects, which lasted about 8 to 9 months, NBS would then translate the insights from the projects and then disseminate, freely make the insights available on their website and so forth. The paper that I'm talking to you about today is focused on this aspect of conducting research. So we really took a deep dive into how does this process of researchers and managers conducting research together over 8 to 9 months, how does that look like? And so I'm not going to go into all the details of the data, but I'll just tell you 2 quick things which may be relevant for you as you think about your own research projects. One is that at the bottom, you will see that these projects, like I said, lasted 8 to 9 months, and they largely followed what you would follow if you were conducting either a qualitative research project or a systematic review of the literature. Those were the 2 approaches that NBS followed. And even though you followed all the steps of these research projects, what was different is that the managers were involved in every step. So they were involved when researchers defined the questions, designed their study, made sense of the data, and so on and so forth, which was very different and unique from us as researchers independently conducting a research project. I also want to say a little bit about my role, because again, I think that we need new designs, research designs, to be able to create relevant and rigorous knowledge. So I observed 2 projects. One was in one project, I was an independent sort of observer, just looking in, taking notes, understanding insights. And I would go back to Tima and share these insights with her. And what we did was, over the course of the project, really come up with some of the things that are working, that are not working. In the second project that I observed, I took some of these insights back into the meeting in order to see how I, as a participant observer in managing some of these meetings, can introduce some of these insights that are gathered from the first project and see if they are working or not. And that gave us a lot of confidence in terms of the conclusions that we were making out of our data. And again, I'm happy to talk in more detail about what that looked like in terms of our review process at the journal. But right now, I would just say that thinking about what role do you play, we took a lot of care in terms of maintaining really detailed notes, really a huge transparency and sort of reliability and validity came from the rigor of that note-taking. But it was different than just being an observer or fly on the wall. We also engaged in a lot of member checks along the way. We had the privilege, because Tima led Network for Business Sustainability, we had amazing access to the people we were studying. So we continuously fed back our emerging insights to the people at various steps in the process that really helped us refine our frameworks and give confidence in our data. So again, like I said in the beginning, I do want to give you a sense of what co-creation really looks like when the rubber hits the road. So just bear with me as I take you through what did co-creation look like in our data, and also what did co-creation not look like absence of co-creation look like. So I'm going to tell you two examples. One is what I'm calling a moment without co-creation. And in the second slide, I'm going to tell you a moment with co-creation. So in terms of us looking in, a moment without co-creation had certain characteristics. Researchers had an inflexibility toward changing the ideas. So imagine a researcher is coming into this meeting. They've done their work in terms of whatever step of the research process they are in, and they're sharing that with the managers. And then managers are engaging with those ideas. So moments without co-creation had some sort of inflexibility that researchers showed in terms of the inputs that managers had for changing some of those ideas. Also, managers often passively listened or failed to contribute. And then the frameworks and what we're calling the objects that researchers brought to the meeting were deemed as incomplete, were deemed as finished, not incomplete. So researchers were largely updating the managers about their process. So let's see what that looked like. So this is, we don't have to look at the details of the framework. This framework was introduced by the researchers into the meeting. This project was around long-term thinking. The researchers were doing a systematic review of prior work on long-term thinking, and they were trying to make sense of this prior work. So they introduced this framework, and then the manager says, you have built this framework by putting in buckets of what you're finding. Is there a filter that would be applied to this? Because I think every industry has a different definition of time. Again, going back to the slide I showed, managers are looking for concreteness in terms of their organization, their industry, their day-to-day. But the researcher says, we don't do by industry. We cannot go too far in the industry specific. Industries differ so much. Again, the idea is that the managers are trying to take a concrete approach, while researchers saying that to be able to generate abstract knowledge, we cannot go into details of each industry's definition of time. So there's some inflexibility to change. Then the manager said, maybe we cannot get too company specific. What I'm saying is not everybody has the same definition of long-term. Again, the researchers sort of pushing back, saying, it's worth mentioning some of what you may be looking for may not actually be written about or not written about rigorously. What we're updating you is based on what we've actually seen in the literature. The idea being that managers are struggling to contribute, and the researchers are taking a stance where they're simply updating and informing about the work they've already done. So at the end of this meeting, nothing would change. The framework that they brought in is the framework that the researchers leave with. In contrast, the co-creation moment, researchers expressed some uncertainty. They did not have all the answers. They asked managers questions instead of simply informing them. Managers were able to actively contribute. And then the frameworks that they brought to the meeting were incomplete, or at least presented as incomplete. And here's an example that I really love from our data, and it is explained more in our paper. So again, the same project, long-term thinking, researchers saying, instead of us showing our concepts in a graph, let me take the example of a baseball and a baseball drafting and map those drafting decisions. So by its very nature, this idea of using an illustration, the framework is incomplete because it will likely not go in the report. So it's presented as, let me give you an example so that we can work on it together. So researchers is saying, we have used the analogy for baseball. Is this clear? Are there confusing terms? I would like to replace this example with something from your business. So the object is presented as incomplete and the researcher is asking questions. So the first manager says, I first looked and I went baseball. I said, wow, that just shot me out of left field. But then she's saying, because it's not my industry, it's a baseball, I can actually look at it and say, I get that. Second manager is saying, it's very easy to understand the trade-off through a baseball example. It gets more complicated in real world. Now, she's saying that I'm going to roll up my sleeves and actually create a graph for you for our project. And she's saying, I will try to develop a bubble using an example from a sector that I am familiar with and share it with everybody. As opposed to the prior example where they were just passively listening or trying hard to contribute, in this case, they're actually rolling their sleeve and saying, I will develop an example for you. So they're actively contributing and changing the objects. So what we saw across the two projects that we studied was that the co-creation moments were far and wide. They were not as significantly or periodically occurring. And yet, managers kept returning, researchers continued their work, and then the projects produced what they set out to produce, which also gave us a sense that we need to zoom out and look at what's happening across and between these events and not just focus on co-creation moments. So what we draw from here to understand that is what's called process ontology. The idea is that that process is fundamental to understanding the world, and things do not change, things are process. So river is not an object but an ever-changing flow. Sun is not a thing but a flaming fire. Everything in nature is matter of process, of activity, of change. So we found that our participants in these projects were inadvertently taking a process view in participating or adopting this process ontology in participating in these projects. So look at what this researcher is saying. This researcher is saying that I can't really remember one instance. So we are asking the researchers, what is the moment of co-creation? What is the moment of not co-creation? And this researcher is the interviewee is pushing back and saying there's not one instance that happened where we said, okay, we now agree on something. It was a process over time. Then this manager is saying something similar, that the gap between an academic report at the end of the project and my need as a practitioner is too wide to bridge in one meeting. So what he's saying is that his thinking was nudged all along the way, and we were building on each other's insights over time. Again, saying that co-creation is not in this moment, but it's really a process over time. And this work continues between the events. So what we theorize in the paper and what that helped us understand by looking at the work between these meetings were what we're calling two devices, that the participants were making temporal connections between the events, and they were not only making incompleteness evident within a meeting, but also incompleteness across the meeting. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into detail of what these two devices really looked like, but what I will leave you with is, sort of our final framing of how co-creation is really a process in which, managers and researchers' knowledges are imbricated over time. There are moments, which are the stars that you see of co-creation, but also through temporal connections and these incompleteness in objects, co-creation is really a process, which, makes sense if you think about, if you have ever been involved in a co-creation process too, where it is sort of an engagement over time. I also want to share with you something that I have been experiencing since the paper came out. As early career scholars, we're always sort of told about all the challenges that are facing us if we care about impact. And I found once our insights came out, once our paper came out, the response was just simply overwhelming in the sense of just stickiness of the idea, and people reaching out and sort of us doing these podcasts and blog posts and speaking in spaces like this one. So the idea being that what I want to leave you with is to say that we don't have to accept the trade-off between doing impactful work and doing rigorous work. We can choose, we can reject that dichotomy, and it may take more time and it may be more challenging, but I'm hoping that this example will tell you that there is a chance to be able to engage in a research project such that it's both rigorous and relevant. I'm going to so I feel like we're about 40 minutes in in my talk today. And like I said, I do want to leave some time to talk about other things and hear from you. So I'm going to skip this paper. This is a more recent paper in which we are using similar data, but really talking about the practices of systematic review. And if in the Q&A at the end, if you feel that you have a question that I can answer related to this project or how this project connects to the previous project that I just described to you, I'm happy to revisit that. I'm going to move forward because there are other things that I do want to share with you beyond just sort of the research I'm doing. So let me just move ahead. What I want to also describe to you a little bit is that, we cannot care about impact and we cannot do impact work as scholars in isolation. I think research is a conversation, it's a social process, and impact is even more so. So what I have also been trying to do in collaboration with many, many others, some of them here on this call today, is create an academic community such as this one that all of us are together today, and think about what does it really take for us to be successful as impact scholars. And so I'm going to share with you three opportunities that I'm involved in. And it's really also an invitation to you to join any of these opportunities as you see fit. So I mentioned B Corps before. And those of you who don't know B Corps are these for-profit businesses who get certified for their business practices, that they really have a positive social and environmental impact. And so a big part of my research agenda has been studying these B Corps. And again, some of you may already be studying as well. So I have been involved in what's called the B academics community. So B academics are really academics who want to study B Corps, teach about B Corps, and help the B Corp movement grow by providing research insights. So I had the opportunity to join their founding board of B academics, and we are about 1,500 members strong right now and continuously growing. And I've been sort of managing the research committee there, encouraging or inviting support, or providing support and inviting conversations in how we can support each other in doing research around B Corps. And I invite you to join this community if you think it's valuable. If you go to the B Academics website, you should be able to sign up. I also want to talk about the impact scholar community. Again, I'm assuming a lot of you here are also part of that community that Sylvia has really spearheaded, and I'm fortunate to work with her and Nicholas in creating this impact scholar community. The idea for this community came from the fact that early career scholars are not asked, required, encouraged to talk about impact until they have tenure. And a lot of us are challenging that a little bit and saying that, if we wait until tenure, we won't know how to really engage with practice. And so this community is about having dialogues like that and thinking about okay, how can we support each other as early career scholars as well as senior scholars who are part of this community? How can they support this early career scholar community? If you go to the Impact Scholar Community website, you can sign up there too and participate in that dialogue as well. And then I continue to work with Network for Business Sustainability. What I realized as I was sort of coming out of my postdoctoral fellowship was the fact that all of us want to do work of impact, but we really don't have resources to do that. At least in my PhD program, I was never taught how to do the research the way I just described to you in terms of involving managers. That was never a question in our research methods classes. It was kind of a moot point. And so what I've been doing in leading these co-creation resources is thinking about, okay, what do researchers like me need to be able to engage in this work? And we produce every 2 months a resource that we hope is valuable. And if you go to this URL that I say at the bottom at NVS's co-creation webpage, you will be able to read a lot of some of that what I have written, others have written in terms of how do we do this impact work. I also want to share with you a current design that I'm involved in. The 2 projects that I mentioned to you earlier have been really something that are in the past. We've completed them, but I do want to share a current design, again, to give you a flavor of many ways that we can co-create knowledge. And this project is really led by Tima, and she has collaborated with another social innovation lab in Canada. The idea is that how do we really actuate systems change through innovation? So what this lab does is it encourages the participants to move from a really firm-centric view of innovation to the system-centric view. What does that mean? That means that if I'm a product and innovation manager, I'm most likely, my mandate is to think about how can my next innovative product and services benefit my organization, my customer, or maybe my shareholders? And how do we take that innovation process and take a more systemic view? And that's what this lab is all about. How are we able to move from form to systems? So this is a 5-year effort. So we are in year 2. In terms of who's involved, like I said, Tima from Ivy Business School is leading the lab. And then this solution lab that I'm talking about is also based out of Canada, Toronto. It's called Mars Solution Lab. They do a lot of systems work. So it's really a cool partnership between academia and practice. 20 Canadian companies have signed up for this 5-year term to be involved in this lab. There are other academics like me and Sylvia, and then Angela Greco, who probably is also on the call today, who are participating as academics. There's a keynote speaker who also always straddles between the practice and research worlds. And then there are lots of students, PhD students and master's students who participate in these lab meetings. The way that this lab was designed, and I want to also offer you pragmatism as one philosophy to understand your own impact work and to design your own impact work. So that is pragmatism is underlying the creation of this lab. What pragmatism, at least from the tradition of William James and Dewey, what pragmatism says is that it really values experience, and what drives actions is whether my particular action and decision, is it useful? So there's always a look toward the future. Is it useful? What that approach helps us to is turn our attentions to tools and frameworks that managers can use in the future to move from a firm-centric to a system-centric approach to innovation. And interestingly, and in the spirit of co-creation, these tools and frameworks are generated via a collective inquiry. Now, what does that collective inquiry look like? So I'm going to give you a quick flavor of each lab session, and these happen quarterly. So before a lab session, which is focused on a specific topic, Tima will get together with Mars Solution Lab and they will prepare materials. So what the co-creation looks like that a little bit differently, because Tima is really bringing her research skills into the picture in terms of abstraction, in terms of challenging the assumptions of some of these frameworks, in terms of creating a narrative arc around the many frameworks so that there is not randomness that usually comes if you don't take a pause and think about assumptions. Then the keynote provocateur that is involved in each lab session, he or she will introduce the ideas. And again, because this person is straddling research practice worlds, this keynote speaker would suggest abstract ideas, but also give insights on concrete use of those ideas. Then academics will work with managers in small groups to discuss and apply some of these ideas introduced. And at the end of the session, through this entire process, we sort of, the organizing team of the lab would really update these tools and frameworks that have been introduced in the lab. And at the end of the 5 years, the hope is that these tools now represent both academic and practical knowledge. And by making them freely available, managers are likely to adopt these frameworks to make their innovation process systemic and hence have broader impact in the world. So the last thing I want to say before sort of I open it up to your inputs and your questions is that, what I sort of all the examples and journey that I shared with you, I have left out many of the challenges that all of us face and I face in caring about impact. And I'm going to just sort of list a few of them, and I would love your reactions to some of those challenges in your own experience. So some of the things that I am grappling with right now as an impact scholar is this issue of identity, So currently in our academic system, the incentives, the support, really do not help one to craft an identity as an impact scholar. Usually, if somebody says that they care about impact, it's seen as a lack of serious scholarship. So I share this example often with people. I was still a postdoctoral fellow. I went to a junior faculty consortium at AOM, and there was a big panel, and some of you must have also participated in such consortia. So there's a huge panel of senior scholars, and they're talking about publications and how do you really, and I asked a question about, I care about impact, and, can you also speak a little bit about how at this moment as postdoctoral fellow, I can think about impact. And I was quickly dismissed and said that you don't have to worry about that right now. That will come when tenure comes. And I wasn't surprised for sure, because again, for all the various reasons that I said to you, but it did make me wonder sort of what system are we operating in? And I have to say that the narrative is changing, when I now attend academy meetings, especially with divisions like organization and environment and social issues and management, I think a lot of my peers want to change that narrative, and they do care about impact, and a lot of senior scholars support that. But I do want to say that we are self-selected group wanting to create change from inside, but there is this larger ecosystem around us. And how do you claim an identity as an impact scholar in that ecosystem while not trading off your identity as a serious scholar? Then there's this issue of time. So personally for me, I have my family, I have, my teaching. Now I have to manage an undergraduate program. I want to participate in community building. I want to, of course, do my own research. And then there's so many pulls on my time. And the impact work that I want to do is not incentivized. So when my promotion and tenure decision comes, I can only hope that whatever impact work I've done is of value. But the incentive system is pushing me to consider or make choices that are directly related to my research or maybe a little bit of my teaching. And so how do we, as impact scholar, address that pulls on our time? Then there's issue of skills, right? So every time I write for practice, I feel I have to completely unlearn everything I have learned in writing an academic article, and then think about how do I speak to, a person I would meet in a party, or speak to a stranger on the street. And that's a completely different way of writing. And I feel that challenge every time I take off my hat of writing for academic publications and then writing for practice. I also told you about a lot of networks that I have been fortunate to be involved in, but I recognize that those networks with practitioners are not available to everyone. They're not very easy to come by, and especially if you don't have mentors who introduce you or invite you into these networks. As an early career scholar, that's a big obstacle to doing the work of impact. And then the last thing I would say is that this is, the issue of activism in many ways. And I even sort of pause when I use the word activism because, as scholars, that's not what we do. We are objective, observer, reporters, rigor comes from independence. But as impact scholars, sometimes we have to let that go. And even this example, those of you who have participated in impact scholar community conversation, it is very evident in those conversations that some of us want to transform academia, so challenge the current incentive system, while some of us want to reform academia, saying that what can I incrementally change so that my work as impact scholar is feasible, even if it's not rewarded. So I think those are some of the things that I experience, in my own efforts. And I'm sure a lot of you may resonate with some of that, but that's where I want to stop and sort of hear more from you in terms of your questions and your own experiences. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here.
Thank you, Garima. This is really interesting and insightful. I just want to, let's open up for questions. I understand there have been some questions and comments raised in the chat function. Rather than me going through them, would you be willing to unmute yourself and ask your questions, please? And also in terms of the format, if you're able to unmute yourself, we want to make this experience personal. So if you're able to, please unmute yourself and ask Garima your question directly. However, if for some reason you're not able to ask a question, please type it up in the chat function and I can read it out. If you feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. Alternatively, you can also just raise your hand in the participants function and I can call you out by name if you prefer some order. Thank you.
I have a question for Garima. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for today. I have just started my PhD program and I am a practitioner. I have a consulting firm. I have been an entrepreneur since 16. So I come from the practice end of things into the research end of things. Any advice that you have for me? My advisor is trying to scare me on what I'm going to face with the publication, with the research, with how disconnected the practice and the research will be. But I would really appreciate any insight and any advice that you have.
That's such a great question, Christina. Also, welcome to the world of academia. I think you have so much to add for all the reasons that I said, in terms of all the experience and intuition, right, that you bring to the table, and you will be able to craft questions and see things in the data that most of us won't be able to see because we don't have your experience. So I guess my first hope is that you don't lose that. Like, don't let academia jade you into thinking that that's not valuable. That's valuable, right? But this other piece that I want to say is that, I think academia is an apprenticeship model, right? So you learn by doing. And it's an entirely different knowledge system, right? So I think what every advisor is saying is valuable in terms of you probably will have to suspend some of your frustration about not having a line of sight from the work you're doing and impact to learn some of the tricks of the trade, right? So I think it's easy to choose one or the other, but I think successful impact scholars, in my opinion, are one who stay in this zone of tension, who are frustrated, right? And they say that, okay, I need to learn how to do this rigorous research, but then I just don't want to give up, this vision of impact on practice. And I think spaces like this, hopefully you can bring more specific problems that we can help you answer. You know, all the best.
Okay, I can see Subhanjan raise his hand. Would you like to ask a question, please?
Yeah, hi. Hello, Garima. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful talk, and I really enjoyed listening to you. In fact, I am a social entrepreneurship researcher, and I do refer to some of your work. But my question is more not from my own research perspective, but I also happen to give service as a coordinator of the doctoral program in the business school. I work in New Delhi, India. And my question to you is if you can share some thoughts on how do we encourage the scholars in a doctoral program to become impact scholars, particularly those who are more into mathematical modeling and quantitative research, hypothetical deductive, because I am a qualitative researcher, and I know, given the nature of the research that we do, to a certain extent we have to engage with the actors on ground. But then what do we recommend, what do we suggest to doctoral scholars who are more into survey research, or perhaps they're into mathematical modeling? How can they make their work more impactful? Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for doing that important service work of coordinating a doctoral program and really caring about impact and taking this conversation. You're sort of the boundary spanner, right, between this world and their, training. And so a lot of people that I work with and that I listen to and read about, I think there is a consensus almost that qualitative work is probably more conducive to providing insights or sort of engaging in this aspect of co-creation. But through NBS, I've also come to know many models that are fairly quantitative, and so what does that look like in terms of, okay, how do I involve practitioners in those models? And so whether it's numbers or whether it's interviews, there are always assumptions that we are making as researchers, right? So we are assuming, we are creating our hypothesis, we're making assumptions about the right models to use, about the right techniques to use. When we rerun our models, we are changing some of those assumptions. And I think that's a great entry point for practitioners to weigh in. So if I'm creating an agent-based simulation and I'm deciding sort of what are the underlying ways that my agents will behave, you don't have to do that work alone. Talk to people who do that work, and talk to practitioners and get their insights on how to create those models. And I think that would be an easy, not easy, but straightforward way to involve practitioners in quantitative work, in my opinion.
And I'm so sorry if I may, just another thing there, how to help them uh, go beyond any kind of hesitation or shyness that they may have to reach out. What do you recommend
to reach out to practitioners?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I think a part of it is sort of people like you and others who can create those links for them, right? So Be Academics is a great example. So as Be Academics, sort of being the hub of this connection between 1,500 scholars and B Corp and B Lab, we have the opportunity to create those connections, create those research exchanges, create a space, and I think involving, in my experience, if you say that it's a PhD student or any student, practitioners love to engage in a discussion where they think they're talking to a student. And so involving them more and more in your PhD program and hopefully fostering that connection. But I would say people like boundary spanners like you and others will have to do that work, I think, for at least the early career PhD student, unless they're like Christina, who already come with great networks. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sure, no problem.
Hello, if I might ask a question. Hi, it's Christine here. Garima, thank you so much. That's really interesting. And I was really interested also in your bit about including practitioners in systematic literature reviews, because I'm 9 months in, and I have got a small panel that I'm using, but I don't really know how to use them other than on a rather ad hoc basis. I just call them up and have a chat. So it's not hugely systematic. So you skipped over those slides because you thought you might not have time, but I'm just wondering if you could just give a bit of advice about how you'd use that, and would you be able to share the slides?
Yeah, I would share the slides definitely. I'm also happy to send across the paper to you, because in the paper we have this whole table where at each step we identify the tension and then what are some of the practices to navigate those tensions. It's a very concrete, I would say, paper. It was a part of a special issue on literature reviews. So we sort of coming into the conversation saying this is co-creative systematic review. So I would be happy to share that. I think for now, what I'll say is that, so what NBS did fantastic, which I think makes so much sense, is that, they were committed to involving managers as knowledge partners, right? So they were saying nobody could take a back seat, right? So the project managers who were facilitating these conversations, and it wasn't in every meeting, but in most meetings, they weren't like letting managers just sit there or letting researchers just sort of update. They were pulling them in terms of saying, okay, what do you think? How would you change? How would this? So I think maybe committing to this being a journey that you share with the managers, and not thinking of this as only your dissertation and your project, and thinking, okay, what does knowledge partnership look like? How can I frame it to the managers that I'm not simply updating them, I want them to have a stake in the research that I'm doing, I think that, to me, that's the key in many ways. But I'll be happy to send that paper to you, and hopefully that table we have created would help you.
Super, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you for advice.
Thank you for your question.
Garima, there's a question in the chat function. Hansang is asking, hi Garima, great presentation. Just want to know if you agree that practitioners focus more on phenomena while academia scholars focus on theories.
What's the name of the person who asked the question? I'm looking.
Hansang Zhang.
Okay, yeah, I can't find it. So you're saying, is it fair to say that academics focus more on theory and practitioners focus more on phenomena? Well, I think our review process forces us to focus on theory. I am a very phenomena-driven researcher. I think, and I'm not saying that's the right way, but I'm just saying that's one way, So if I can't engage with the phenomena, if I can't engage with the, people that I'm studying, I find it very hard to theorize, But I think if I take a step back and think about what our review process forces us to do largely is, including myself when I review, because that's sort of, our trade, right? Our trade is to look at the empirical phenomena and then take a step back and think about what's the theorizing here. And, I don't think that's wrong at all. I think that's what we do. That's the profession we've chosen into that has value. I think where there may be a little bit of disconnect is if that's the holy grail of making or breaking into a journal article, So I don't know if I've answered the question directly, but I think broadly you can categorize phenomena-driven and theory-driven, but there are many researchers like myself who are extremely phenomena-driven. I think it's more our system that makes us focus more on the theorizing.
Whilst I was thinking about the question, I have a question, Garima, if I may. From your experience, what tips and perhaps pitfalls to avoid would you suggest to early career scholars or PhD students?
I think the biggest sort of suggestion I'll have to make is that I've seen people sort of go in one direction or the other, and I've said this before, but I think it's worth repeating. So, you know, going toward the relevant side, you know, you sort of give up your tools of rigor, right? So you engage with practice in a way that's completely focused on solving their problem then and there, you know, so there's no sort of taking a step back and thinking about knowledge generation for everyone to use. On the other side, I think we can be at fault in terms of not thinking about practice at all, right? And just thinking about what's my next publication. And I think the biggest advice I would say is that don't choose one side. Like, don't choose one side. I think you have to continue. It's almost sort of this worldview that you have to continuously think about both. How am I creating novel theoretical insights, and what would those insights mean to practice? How would they use it? And stay in that challenging zone, even though nobody's asking you to think about impact on practices yet, but thinking about both as at every step of your research process, and not just go in one direction or the other.
Thank you. There are a couple more questions in the chat. First one from Fariba Darabi. Thank you for your great talk, Garima. What do you think about co-creation with scholarly outputs with SMEs, given their limited resources?
Limited resources of the SMEs, yeah. So I personally don't have experience working with SMEs. I think the organizations I have worked with are large organizations. I think whether it's SME or not, actually, I wouldn't say that. My current work, you know, is with slums in India. And so this point has become even more salient to me, that how do I, as researcher, not only take, right? What do I give back? And so when we think about SMEs, I think that question becomes even more salient. So if they don't have the resources, what are the various ways that their involvement can be beneficial to that their involvement in your research project can be beneficial to them? Can you conduct seminars for them? Can you share your research insights with them? Can you help them solve an immediate organizational problem, even though it's not part of your research mandate? Can you do a training for them? I think there are many ways that we can think about a reciprocal relationship with SMEs, even though they may not have sort of a lot of resources for continued engagement with you. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Another question is from Laura, which also seems to be reflecting Sarah Woodside's question is, can you share more about the connection between co-creation and participant action research?
So the way I understand co-creation is, and again, this is my experience of the couple of projects I've been involved in. There may be different ways to understand co-creation, but the way I understand is that a participant action research is solving a specific problem of a specific organization. So you have an intervention as a researcher, you see the outcome of that intervention, you feed that back into the system, and then you decide your next intervention. So it's very specific to an organizational problem and the cycle of intervention, action, reflection. The way I understand co-creation is that the objective driving co-creation is knowledge generation broadly. You know, so what we went in, or NBS went in terms of co-creation, is how can I create rigorous and relevant answers to a problem that a big set of organizations who care about sustainability want to address. Now, the participation of these managers did not mean that they are getting an answer to their own problem in their organization. Actually, in many cases, that didn't mean at all. I think there's a broader mandate of knowledge creation that I see is different from action research. But both are, I think, valid pathways for impact.
Hi, Garima. This is Priyanka. I really enjoyed your conversation. I think your focus on your challenge around identity and how you try and navigate, I think, is a really important one. How did you So I have two questions. So one is about identity. How did you navigate between a business scholar versus an impact scholar, and the switch that you made from business school to a public policy school? What was your thought process in that? If you could share a little bit more on that, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, no, so I think the latter is fairly easy to say. It's not, I think I wasn't going in thinking, hey, I can create more impact as a being in a public policy school. It was more a decision of, it was more driven by personal decision in terms of where I want to live, where's my family, and what are the opportunities available. So I wasn't sort of being intentional and taking a plunge into the public policy school. I think the opportunities that I face now is some of them are just because I decided to take this job in a public policy school. So a lot of it is, incidental to, where I wanted to be. But then given that, how do I craft, these opportunities into my own impact agenda is sort of a question in front of me, or opportunity in front of me now. Also, in terms of sort of thinking about myself as a business research scholar and thinking about myself as an impact scholar, I'm hoping that those two will not be separate for us on this call and beyond this space, right? So as a community, our goal is like we can merge them, so a business research scholar is an impact scholar. And I would just repeat what I said in the beginning. I think I was fortunate to have mentors like Tima, and then experience with Network for Business Sustainability. And I see my eyes on the call who's with Network for Business Sustainability, and having colleagues like that really helped me understand that it's okay, it's not even okay, it's great to claim this identity of an impact scholar. And again, that doesn't mean I don't get pushback. I do get pushback, but then thinking about, which spaces, which conversations I want to join, which spaces I want to be in. And I can't emphasize enough that you have to show rigorous research to be able to talk about rigor and relevance, right? So that cannot be compromised. So I cannot be screaming from the rooftop that I care about rigor and relevance while I haven't really shown to the world that I can do rigorous research. So I think that's almost a part of the process. So I don't know if that answers your question, Priyanka, with some of the things.
I guess my second question is a little bit more specific to the model that you showed in the beginning, where you show identification and then research and then translation. We as a team, we've been trying to do a systematic literature review around research translation and how that's done. And what you are suggesting as term of co-creation, what we are learning is that if you start at that co-creation level, then the translation is almost not necessarily needed, because what you create is going to be relevant to the people that you're creating it for. So were you able to also see some of that from the translation perspective as well, or was this specifically for the research aspect?
Well, no, I've been involved in some translation efforts with NBS. And again, I think Maya is still on the call. She largely leads, Maya largely leads the translation efforts at NBS. So I highly encourage you to speak with her afterwards. So I think, so I'm so excited that you're doing a systematic review and translation. I can't wait to read it. And so what I would offer to you for now is this idea that, translation is still important, even within NBS. Once the research project was finished, there were a lot of different outputs that came out of it in terms of case studies, checklists, so on and so forth, that were really focused on translation. But the researcher was largely not doing that. NBS was doing that. So that's a little bit of difference. And researchers were still sort of working toward their academic publications. Some of them were involved, some of them were not involved. The other piece I will say is that as you do your review of systematic review, sort of thinking about what's the difference between mobilizing and disseminating and translating, right? So I think the stages of mobilizing and disseminating can still be very co-creative, and translations still can be one way. So, it's almost like you break translation into mobilizing, disseminating, and then sort of end of pipe translating. So maybe playing with that a little bit. We do, the last Impact Scholar Community event was on translation. We had 3 excellent scholars and 1 practitioner who talked about translation. So I believe the recording is available now if you want to go back and look at it in case you missed that event.
Thank you so much.
Another question from the chat. Oh yeah, please, Majid.
Yeah, hi, very nice, thank you for presenting. One question I have, as business scholars, we always say evaluation of whatever we are creating, whether we're creating value for society, shareholders, or anything. How do you say you evaluate this, anything that you co-created, whether for the business schools or for researchers, or of course for researchers we can say that they have published something, but for example for those businesses who were co-creating things. So.
Right. That's such a great question, because impact is such a elusive idea, right? So all of us are talking about impact, but most of us don't know what that is, right? So if I may, I'm just going to quickly share a slide that I couldn't share when I was speaking, but I tried to think about this idea of impact in this paper that I couldn't share, that Tima and I just published. So let me just unhide this slide. And tell me, do you see it? Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So again, this paper is about systematic reviews, co-creative systematic reviews, right? So this is a special issue on literature review. We were so fortunate to have Jean Bartonic as our editor, and there's this great set of 3 reviewers who are saying to us, you are talking or leading in with this idea of impact, well, what does impact really mean in your context, right? So they're pushing us. So here is what our sense making was. And this is also based on prior work. So there has been discussion on what research impact looks like. So impact as outcomes, impact as changes to self, and impact as understanding the other. So what does impact as outcome mean? So we said that there are actionable frameworks for practice. So when we interviewed managers participating in these projects or their colleagues, they could provide us with evidence of how they have used these frameworks that have come at the end of the project. Then, I haven't included sort of academic publications, but those will be involved there, would be included there too. Then, NBS won a couple of awards, like Canada's Clean 50, based on some of the projects that they did. That's one indication. Then we also looked at metrics of website views of NBS reports. So how many reports were viewed across, 2 or 3 years, as obviously there's no baseline, but it's some indication that if the one report is viewed 34,000 times, it's some indication that there are eyeballs on what has come out of the project. Then impact as changes to self. So a lot of the researchers and managers we interviewed talked about how managers talked about how they learned the craft of research, at least got introduced to it, how they learned how to think about things differently. Same with researchers, they understood sort of their, phenomena differently because of, what they talked, because of participating in the project. And then what we call is impact as understanding the others. So you have insights of, better insights of the differences between researchers and managers. You're also learning each other's language. And I love this quote where this researcher is talking about, how she loved this moment where there was this light bulb, where people in the room sort of went to a different place, because what they knew in terms of the phenomena, the managers, they left that behind, and they were looking at the same phenomena in a different light. So those are the 3 ways we describe impact in the paper. But I value your question. I think it's still a very elusive phenomena that I'm hoping some of us will continue to answer.
Yes, thank you so much. I think these are very good. It's just going to be very, very difficult to convince so many of those people who are into, I guess, monetary kind of impact or very subjective impact. It would be, I mean, these are very, very good ones. I think it would be enough for me as a researcher, but I feel like it's a little bit difficult to, from many people's point of view, objectively kind of like, measuring that kind of impact.
Right.
But it's good for me.
Yeah, I think there's so some of people have joined from Europe, and what I hear, I don't know the framework, but the research excellence framework in European schools really lay out how you quantify your impact. And maybe you already know this, but I think that might be another framework to consider as we think about quantifying our own impact.
Before I read out another question from the chat, I just want to say that next Wednesday we have another webinar on scholarly impact with Professor Herman Aguines, who is the president of AOM. I will send the details of that by email as a follow-up after the session. There's another question for you, Garima, from Susie Diaz. She's asking, what is the pandemic's role, presumably COVID's pandemic, in co-creation among people from different parts of the world? How to strengthen this relationship?
Yeah, I think this pandemic is such a unfortunate situation, and yet it gives us so many opportunities. So I will go back to the Innovation Learning Lab because that's most recent, and I've been involved somewhat in that organizing, and for them to pivot from meeting face-to-face to meeting online and continuing that co-creation work was quite a process. And so I think, especially when you say around the world, I think technology gives us such a great opportunity to be able to involve people from around the world in the dialogue on co-creation. So that's good. But then the other things as fatigue and time zones and, missing the social networks that you build that are important for co-creation. So I think those are some of the things that when you think about doing this online, you'll have to think about. But I would personally say it does provide with many opportunities in order to involve a broader group of people.
Lecha, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Garima, for a very insightful session. My question to you is this. I was recently attending the SMS conference and parallelly also attending a practitioner conference, which was based on sustainability. I tried to take out a few questions that we had posed in some of our, I think it was a stakeholder group, interaction group or something, and I had planted it into the practitioner group, trying to see what answers I can group. So one of the questions was on how institutional arbitrage can happen in global value chains and how that could be one of the reasons people are trying to reach out to poorer nations or developing nations. And to my dismay, I mentioned this very sentence that I got very glossy answers in the practitioners forum. And when I was discussing this again in another session at SMS, I posed this question as to whether we are looking at different type of problems. Academics look at sustainability problems from one lens, and practitioners look at it from another lens. So now when I attend this discussion of yours, I'm thinking whether co-creation can happen in terms of problem identification in situations, in things like sustainability, where academicians might have a totally different view of problems of sustainability and how it can be solved vis-a-vis practitioners. What are your views about it?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think what you're pointing to is a very salient issue. When I said, others have talked about, I believe it's Shapiro, and I can look up the citation and send it to you. But the idea being that impact is a is an issue of defining the right question. And so I highly resonate with what you're saying. It is about issue of defining the right question. And I also want to go back to sort of your really commendable effort of taking questions from an academic community and sort of posting it in the practice community. And what we have to think about is, like, in all that I just described for the last 90 minutes, I'm sort of framing managers as somebody who would just jump at the opportunity of co-creation, right? But like their incentive systems have got nothing to do with engaging with researchers, right? So that's a false assumption that they would be jumping at an opportunity like this. So we have to really be strategic about how we're involving. And so if I have to say one thing to you, Lekha, in terms of engaging them, would be tell them, so what? Like, why should they respond to this question, right? Like, what is going to come out of it? And that may be one way to engage in that discussion for them to participate. But yeah, but I think your intuition that it's a problem, it's an issue of defining the problem in a way that marries rigor and relevance. I think that's a fair one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Unless there are no other questions, perhaps I could ask one more question, Garima. You alluded to process ontology in your research, and also you alluded to a pragmatist philosophy as a way of doing co-creation research. Do you have any thoughts on, I mean, considering that us as academics, we get obsessed with theory, do you have any thoughts on particular theories that you personally found helpful in this process, in this work of doing impactful research?
Yeah, I think so. Again, I think it really depends on what angle we take in the broad question of co-creation and impact, right? So the angle we were taking is that, almost of time, right? That moment in time cannot explain co-creation. So then that led us to process ontology as one understanding of time, right? In the ORM paper, we take a very theory light approach and we just talk about the prior work that is considered research practice tensions, right? And how systematic review doesn't provide us guidance to navigate those research practice tensions. In the innovation learning lab research that we're doing, we're taking a very pragmatic approach or drawing on pragmatism because our phenomena is very much about these tools and frameworks. And so we're leading into that conversation by thinking, what do these tools and frameworks from a pragmatic lens, how does that explain co-creation? So I think in my mind, it really, again, I'm a very phenomena-driven researcher. So thinking about, okay, what's my angle? What's interesting to me in this big bucket of co-creation? And then almost theory is subservient to that interesting insight that I want to explain.
Okay. Thank you very much, Garima. Unless there are any other questions, I just would like to thank Garima. Thank you so much for taking your time and sharing your insights. This was really, really helpful. And I can see from the chat function, it really triggered a lot of exchange of ideas and networking opportunities as well.
Well, I've input my email into the chat box. I know Priyanka asked me to send Maya's email and I'm having some trouble pulling my Outlook. But if Maya, you're still there, if you could enter your email, or any of you, please feel free to write to me. And I would be so thrilled to continue this conversation online and be a resource for you in all your efforts. And thank you for listening today and sharing your insights.